So today we're going to be looking at bracket multiplication. We're going to have a quick talk about the methods we'll use to multiply out brackets, then we're going to look into some worked examples and then move on to some practice problems. So first of all, if I just start with a simple example such as 2x times by the bracket x plus 2. So here we have to treat this term out front as if it were in its own set of brackets. Now the idea behind this is that every term in this bracket must be multiplied by every term in this bracket. There is only one term in this bracket, as we can see, so if we multiply out the first term we will get 2x multiplied by x, and then if we multiply out the second term we get plus, because this is a plus here, 2x multiplied by 2. So that is everything in this bracket multiplied once by everything in this bracket. And that's the general idea behind bracket multiplication. You have to multiply everything in one of the brackets by everything in the other bracket at least once. So now if we just simplify these expressions, we end up with 2x times x, which is 2x squared, plus 2x times 2, which is 4x. Now if we move on to what happens when you have two brackets involving more than one term in one of the brackets. So by that I mean if we were to have 2x plus 1 multiplied by x plus 3. Here again the same principle stands. Everything in this bracket must be multiplied once by everything in this bracket. Now to solve these double bracket problems as such, it's always good to use something called the claw method. It just avoids mistakes. So what you have to do is you have to draw arrows between each term in this bracket and each term in this bracket. So you have the first term here times by the first term here, then you have the first term here times by the second term here, and then you have the second term here times by the first term here, and the second term here times by the second term here. So these are all multiplications. And if you just write out these arrows every time whilst you're getting used to doing these kinds of problems, it just helps to avoid mistakes. So now you simply follow each arrow and write out the result. So 2x multiplied by x will give me 2x squared. 2x multiplied by 3 will give me plus 6x. 1 multiplied by x will give me plus x, and 1 multiplied by 3 will give me plus 3. And now we can see that these are like terms, so we can easily simplify this to 2x squared plus 7x, simply doing 6 plus 1 plus 3. I do have another video on simplifying like term expressions if you didn't quite understand what I did there by combining that 6x and that 1x in the middle. Now the last type of problem I wanted to mention here is simply if you write two brackets but in shorthand by using a squared. So it's important to note that this simply means everything inside this bracket times by itself twice. So this is equivalent to x plus 2 multiplied by x plus 2. And now again you just use the claw method. First term multiplied by first term multiplied by last term multiplied by first term, and last term multiplied by last term. As such, and then again you just follow the arrows. So we have x times x, x times 2, x times 2, and 2 times 2. Now again simplifying these gives us x squared plus 4x plus 4. So now moving on to some examples. Expand this bracket. So again, it's always good to clarify if you simply put anything out front in its own bracket. It just helps separate them and ensures that you are timesing the brackets out correctly, because you can then draw your multiplication arrows such as this. So again, just follow the arrows. 3 times 5x is 15x. 3 times 2 is 6. I'm multiplying everything in this bracket by everything in this bracket once. Moving on to the next example. Again, just to simplify, or clarify rather, we'll put that in its own bracket, this 4x multiplied by 3x plus 2y. Now again, draw your multiplication arrows, this multiplied by this term, and this multiplied by this term. Everything in this bracket multiplied once by everything in this bracket. And then follow the arrows to give you 4x times 3x, which is 12x squared, and 4x times 2y, which is 8xy. Now, if any of the algebra in these problems is tripping you up, I do have another video on algebra basics if you'd like to go back and have a look at that video. Then it explains these tricks that I'm doing here by multiplying and simplifying. So moving on to the next example. Minus 3x, again, put it in its own bracket for clarity. 2x minus 8. Now, it's important to note this minus 3, because this minus sign has to come with you when you do each of your multiplications. So the general method is the same. Draw your multiplication arrows, but now you just have to be careful to include this minus sign. So I have a minus 3x times a positive 2x, which will give me a minus 6x squared. And then I have a negative 3x multiplied by negative 8, which will give me plus 24x. So now moving on to the next example, and again, if these minus positive minus minus relations are confusing you slightly, again just go back to my algebra basics video and I explain it all in there. The next example now, another double bracket scenario. So now again you adopt the claw method. So you start with the first term and you draw an arrow to the first term here, then you draw an arrow to the second term here, and then you move on to the second term in here. You draw an arrow to the first term in there, and then you draw an arrow to the second term in there. So it's everything in this bracket multiplied by everything in this bracket once. So you should always have 2 arrows pointing to each of these values and 2 arrows coming from each of these values, assuming of course there are only 2 terms in each bracket. So now you just follow these arrows and multiply. So 6x times 2x will give you 12x squared. 6x times 3 will give you plus 18x. 2x times 1 will give you plus 2x. 1 times 3 will give you plus 3. And now simplifying these terms gives you 12x squared plus 20x plus 3. Moving on now to example 5. Again, as I mentioned, this squared here simply means everything in the bracket multiplied by itself twice. So for clarity you should always write out the double brackets that are implied by this squared sign, just for clarity, so that you can see in your mind what you're doing, and it also allows you to employ your claw method. Again, a good check is every value in this first bracket must have 2 arrows originating from it, and every term in this bracket must have two arrows pointing to it, and it's first multiplied by first, first multiplied by last, last multiplied by first, last multiplied by last. So now following these arrows gives you 25x squared plus 5x plus 5x plus 1, just following these multiplication arrows. Again, simplifying those terms in the middle will give you 25x squared plus 10x plus 1. Moving on. Now this is a bit more of a complicated example. This is something more likely to what you may get in the exam. Here we have an x term out front and a squared bracket. So again, I'm going to put the 3x in its own bracket for clarity, and then I'm going to write out the double bracket as implied by the squared sign. 1 second, I do apologise, this is supposed to say 2x, just make that a bit clearer. So the 3x is written out front, put it in its own brackets for clarity, and then this double bracket here is implied by this squared sign, because this squared sign means everything in the brackets times by itself twice. So here you have to split the problem into two sections. So first of all, I'm just going to focus on these brackets here, 3x multiplied by 2x plus 2. It's always good to split these longer problems into pairs of two brackets because we know how to deal with two brackets. You simply do that term multiplied by that term and that term multiplied by that term as before. So this will give you 6x squared plus 6x. And now you can replace these two brackets with this expression here that you've just calculated, and this will give you 6x squared plus 6x times 2x plus 2, because I'm now bringing in this bracket here and I'm replacing this expression with this bracket. So for clarity, let me just rewrite that. 6x squared plus 6 multiplied by 2x plus 2. So now you just times these out using the claw method as you would. First times first, first times last, last times first, and last times last. Now the only complexity here is simply that you have to remember that an x squared multiplied by an x will give you an x cubed. So this will give you 12x cubed. And then this will give you 12x squared. And this will give you 12x. And this will give you 12. And now, of course, there's nothing in here to collect together because these are all separate terms because they have different powers. And this would be referred to as a cubic expression because the highest power here is a cubed term. So moving on to a practice question now. So this is an opportunity for you to pause the video, have a go at it yourself, and then play the video when you would like the worked example. So, if I just rewrite these brackets, and then employ, sorry, that's a minus, and then employ the claw method. First times first, first times last, last times first, and last times last. Or second times second, whichever you prefer. And remembering these are of course multiplications. So now I do this term multiplied by this term, which gives me 10x squared. And I do this term multiplied by this term, which gives me minus 12x. Of course, being careful to note the minus sign here. This is why I have a minus sign here, because this is in reality 2x multiplied by minus 6 because of this sign here. Very important. It's common mistake amongst students is to simply write that as a plus because they haven't included this negative sign here. Now we do second times first, which gives me plus 20x, and then second times second, which is minus 24. Collecting these two like terms in the middle here gives me 10x squared plus 8x minus 24. So moving on to the next example question now. Sorry, the next practice question rather. This is again similar to the complex or more complicated question that I dealt with in example 5. This is more likely or more akin to something you may get in the exam. So again, pause the video, have a go, play it when you would like the solution. So again, I'm going to take this term out front and put it in its own set of brackets for clarity, and then I'm going to write out the triple bracket, because this is a 3, not a squared, the triple bracket that is implied by that cube, because this essentially just means that bracket, or everything in that bracket should I say, multiplied by itself 3 times. And now, remembering what I said earlier, it's always good to look at these longer problems simply in sets of 2, because we know how to deal with 2 brackets. So if I just rewrite this part of the problem, and then I do that term multiplied by that term multiplied by that term, which gives me 6x squared minus 16x. And then I can replace these 2 brackets here now with the answer that I just got. So this is 6x squared minus 16x multiplied by 3x minus 8 multiplied by 3x minus 8. And now again, I just take this pair, because we know how to deal with pairs of brackets. 6x squared minus 16x, 3x minus 8. So I'm just dealing with these 2 brackets now. So if I rewrite that at the top, 6x squared minus 16x, 3x minus 8. This multiplied by this, again employing the claw method. And following each multiplication arrow, I'll get 6x squared multiplied by 3x, which gives me 18x cubed. Then I get minus, so now I follow this line here, 6x squared times minus 8, remembering of course to include the minus again, which gives me minus 48x squared. And then I get minus 16x multiplied by 3x, which will give me minus 3 multiplied by 16, which is 48 again. 48x squared. Then minus 16x multiplied by minus 8, which will give me 100 plus 128x. Now the numbers are getting a bit more complicated, but there's nothing out of reach here. You're just multiplying 2-digit numbers by single-digit numbers, or single-digit numbers together. You can of course just brush up on your long multiplication if it helps you. So 6 times 8 would be 48 here. Carry the 4, and then doing 1 times 8 plus the 4 gives you 12. 128. So then you can gather these terms in the middle here, which will give you minus 96x squared plus 128x, and then the 18x cubed. So this would be your answer to this part. So this is the solution to these 2 brackets, but we're not quite done yet, because there was one more bracket left, the final 3x minus 8. So if I just rewrite this at the top now for clarity, 18x squared minus 96 x cubed, of course I mean, minus 96x squared plus 128x, all multiplied by 3x minus 8. Now you might be thinking that there are 3 terms in here, so things have just gotten a bit more complicated, but the claw methods will still apply. There will just be 2 more arrows coming from this bracket because we have 1 more term. So again, the rules that everything in this bracket must be multiplied by everything in this bracket still stand. So you do that term multiplied by that term, first multiplied by first, first multiplied by last, and then the extra term, which is this middle term, you simply do the middle term times this first term, middle term times this last term, and then you do this last term times this first term, and this last term times this last term. So everything in here has 3 arrows pointing towards it because there are 3 terms in this bracket, and everything in here has 2 arrows coming from it because there are 2 terms in this bracket. Everything in here must be multiplied once by everything in here. So there must be as many arrows pointing to each term in the second bracket here as there are number of terms in the first bracket here, and vice versa, which is why we have 3 arrows pointing to this 3x, 3 arrows pointing to this -8, and then 2 arrows originating from each of these terms. And now once you've drawn your arrows, the problem is as simple as previous problems. You just follow the arrows, doing each multiplication in turn. So first of all, we do 18x cubed times 3x, which give you 54x to the 4, because you're doing x cubed times x, which is x to the 4. Then you do 18 multiplied by -8, remembering of course again to keep the minus sign, which will give you minus 144x cubed. Then you do minus 96, keeping the minus sign again, multiplied by 3x, which will give you minus 288x cubed. And then you do minus 96 multiplied by -8, which will give you plus, because a minus and a minus make a plus, of course, 768x squared. Then you have 128x multiplied by 3x, which will give you 384x. Then you have 128x multiplied by -8, which will give you minus 1024x. So the numbers here are getting slightly more involved, but there's nothing you can't do simply using the long division methods that you already know. So if I were just to pick 128 multiplied by 8 here, ignoring the minus sign just for the second whilst we do the multiplication, and then 8 multiplied by 8 is 64, so I write the 4 and carry the 6. 2 multiplied by 8 is 16, add the 6 will give me 22, so I write the 2 and carry a 2, and then 1 multiplied by 8 is 8, plus the 2 gives me 10, which is 1024 as seen here. Of course now adding in the negative sign that was out here, because this was of course in reality -8. So that's all for this video. Feel free to drop in any questions that you may have into the comments section, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you very much for watching.